Welcome back. Today we're going to go through 2 points, only 2 points of a larger epistemological argument I have on the nature of obedience and knowledge within Protestantism and how those virtues go up against Catholicism. I'm only going to do A, B, and I'll actually probably throw in C as well. Before going on, because I still need to write some of it, but also want to kind of talk about the nuances when talking about a subject like this. I have and I'm working on a criteria, so like a sheet basically that everyone can use, no matter what your worldview is, to engage yourself. First of all, the purpose was so that I can gauge my own worldview and see what criteria fits and can be seen as true or valid versus not. But I'm going to post it on my Substack eventually so that other people can use it, but also so that I'm able to use it as an apologetic tool to insert criteria that's from a different worldview and see if it not aligns, but see if it is worth believing, if there's certitude within it, what authorities they appeal to, and it's a whole thing. So we'll go over that in a different video, but I wanted to touch on three points of an argument that I'm working on, starting with the Protestant epistemic limitations, morality over worship. So something that drove this was, I used to say how Catholics were very legalistic, right? And it's legalism, and they're just modern day Pharisees. And now being on the flip side of it, as I talk to people about liturgy, I'm receiving those comments back towards me. So it spawned an idea. It was like at 1 a.m. And I was like, I don't know, if this works or not, but we're going to run through it. And I think it works. A lot of the stuff that I work on is always working in theory. So I'm always open to objections and critiques. And I try to respond to every comment that comes through. So let's start. So A, the Protestant epistemic limitations, morality over worship. 1. Protestants prioritize moral knowledge as the primary form of obedience. Their understanding of faith often hinges on a personal interpretation of Scripture, leading to a framework where obedience means following moral precepts rather than engaging in liturgical or sacramental acts. 2. Epistemic reductionism. Protestants' reliance on sola scriptura and private interpretation reduces Christianity to what can be intellectually grasped, eliminating sacramental realism and the participatory nature of worship as described in Scripture and commanded in Scripture. 3. Rejection of objective worship. Protestant theology, particularly in its Reformed branches, rejects the idea that God commands specific acts of worships that are binding on all believers. Instead, worship is seen as spontaneous, subjective act rather than a structured, divinely instituted practice. And we can see the fruit of this appeal in almost all Protestant outpourings, outside of maybe high Protestant Anglicanism, where they still have sacraments, whether valid or not valid. But the return to iconoclasts was part of this, but you see a lot of mainstream Christianity subjecting themselves to something called worship, which is actually just singing a song on Sunday, which nowhere in the Bible is articulated as worship, rather that we see as praise, and they are distinct and different things. And worship is very liturgical and ritualistic. This is one thing that I said 6 years ago to a friend who is now Presbyterian. We were at the same church, and I was sitting in his office. He was the discipleship pastor, and I said, I read in Scripture how ritualistic God the Father is in the Old Testament, and how that continues, and how liturgy has continued in the early church. What happened? And so it's very evident when you look at it. So that leads to B. Catholicism's broader epistemology, sacramental and liturgical knowledge. Knowledge in Catholicism is not just intellectual, but participatory. We come to know Christ not just by thinking about him or following his moral teachings, but by worshiping him in a way he commanded. Luke 22, John 6. Sacraments engage the whole person. So baptism, the Eucharist, and confession are not mere moral affirmations, but ontological transformations where grace is objectively given. So I want to stick on this point for a minute because it's very important. The sacraments and the way that the church has always taught liturgy is participatory of the whole person, not just the mental side, the metaphysical side, or even just the vocal side of praise, but the whole of the person, all of the senses, the whole image of God that is replicated in humanity participates in that, reflecting that back to God through the liturgy that we have. I think that's a very important distinction and fact to make, because when you strip away and when you enter into Protestant worship services, you do not participate using all of your senses. Whereas each sacrament in the Catholic Church and in the Orthodox Church, I believe, allows the participation of all the senses. Faith is more than belief. It is embodied in ritual and sacrifice. So the Catholic Church maintains, the Catholic Church maintains that lex orandi, lex credendi, the law of prayer is the law of belief, meaning that worship and doctrine are inseparable. I think I said that wrong in Latin, which leads us to see Protestant legalism as a hidden constraint. So despite rejecting legalism, Protestantism has moralistic rigidity. In rejecting sacraments and liturgical worship, Protestantism ironically replaces them with a hyper-focus on moral conduct, making obedience purely ethical rather than holistic. So what I hear very often is, and it's not untrue, so the purely ethical portion of belief and moral conduct isn't negated, but it is not the sole factor, right? So I'm not arguing that the ethical side of obedience is not required. That's not the argument, and I hope that follows. But rather, I have heard things when I was Protestant. I still hear it today. Choose the next best thing. Choose the next best thing. So the focus is on: am I reflecting the moral attributes of Christ while negating the commands that Christ gave through the Old Testament and fulfilled in the New Testament, mainly through liturgy? So point 2, without an external authority like the church, obedience is subjective too. So Protestants often shift the burden of faith to individual moral discipline. So what we see is an abuse of the scripture in the Pauline theology, which is, all things are lawful, to each their own, whether you drink in this occasion, whether you don't, blah, 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 and so forth. There's many, many different subjective views of it, especially when you get into more moral dilemmas. They shift the burden of faith to individual moral discipline, which creates a paradox. So while accusing Catholics of legalism, they end up following a more burdensome law of self-enforced morality. 3, subjectivism leads to disunity. This is major. Without a sacramental structure, moral interpretations vary widely, leading to doctrinal fragmentation. And this is apparent throughout history with the Reformation. You do not have unity within the Reformation. You do not have unity within the Protestant Church. This is just a sole fact. And when you lack liturgical law or canon and sacramental structure, this embodiment of doctrinal fragmentation only occurs more, which is why high Anglicanism still remains some rigidity within itself in a positive way, because they still adhere to some liturgical structures. So this is point A, B, C with 3 points each underneath it. And I will be posting this soon on my Substack, but I wanted to get this out there, mainly just to see, 1, thoughts, 2, I do believe it is a interesting subject to argue, and 3, if any Protestant out there does have any counter points to A, B, or C. Before moving on to points 2, which contains A, B, C, D, and then there's a conclusion portion before going into a different or a following epistemological argument mainly the Protestant's dilemma. Scripture alone requires an external criterion. So it's a long, lengthy thing, and but I think each thing I think I've done a good job of articulating each thing, but I wanted to do a small chunk before going into a larger chunk. So I hope this was helpful.